The marriage meant nothing. He said it like a verdict, a cool sentence delivered without tremor or triumph, as if the words were a ledger entry rather than a wound. Outside, the bells of St. George's tolled the hour with relentless cheer, chattering to London that a duchess had been made. Inside, Annabel Lancaster, 18, dutiful, very nearly brave, sat so still she could hear the silk of her sleeves breathe against itself. A maid's hand hovered near her veil, stopped, and fell in silence. It was astonishing, Annabel thought, the way a room could fill with thunder when no one spoke. She wanted to say something clever, something white and bright that would make the moment small. She found nothing. The Duke's eyes, grey as pewter, careful as a locked drawer, shifted from her face to the window and back, as if testing the hinge of this new life and deciding it closed well enough. "You will be comfortable," he said at last. "My housekeeper is competent. My expectations are modest and entirely within your ability. There is an allowance and privacy." He was already receding. He had been receding, she realized, since the first bow at the altar. He moved like a tide pulling back from a shore it had never meant to kiss. She could not measure the distance until it widened, and then it was everywhere. In the way he thanked the vicar, with a tone saved for invoices, in how he offered his arm as if proffering a staff to a traveller on a path he would not take, in the carriage ride where the Hartwick crest, gilt and proud on black lacquer, gleamed warmer than his gaze. "Do you understand me?" he asked. Annabel lifted her chin. "I do." Her voice did not shake. That was something. He studied her a heartbeat longer. It felt like sunlight touching the back of a hand through a curtain, a suggestion of warmth that never reached the blood. "We shall endeavour not to inconvenience each other," he said, and the carriage wheels found a rut and climbed it, and she thought, "There, that is the sound of the rest of my life." They went home. Not her home. Not yet. Hartwick House reared up like a promise no one intended to keep. White stone, exact as a reprimand. Windows like ranks of unblinking eyes. Inside, marble gleamed and portraits judged. The first Duchess of Hartwick, solemn in velvet, watched Annabel pass with a mouth that did not quite sneer and did not quite bless. Annabel inclined her head to the painted ascendants, the way a pilgrim greets a shrine whose god is rumoured to be hard of hearing. "Mrs. Fairchild," the Duke said, and the housekeeper materialized, precise as a clock's hand. "Her Grace will require the blue suite." Her Grace. The title slid over Annabel's skin like cold water. "Yes, Your Grace," Mrs. Fairchild replied. "The fires are lit." Annabel thanked her. "Mrs." Fairchild's answering glance was neither kind nor cruel, merely evaluating, as if a tray had been weighed and found adequate. Adequate would do. Adequate had to do. When her trunks had been placed, when her mother's last whispered injunction, "Be obedient," had faded into the corridors like perfume, Annabel found herself alone before a dressing table where a dozen candles made a glory of a woman she did not recognize. The girl who kept a pressed violet from her first waltz between the pages of a novel was not here. In her place sat a duchess with steady eyes and a mouth that had learned somewhere in the church between the second vow and the third how to be a line rather than a curve. She did not cry. Not then. Tears were extravagant, and this new life, she sensed, would require economy. Later he came to her. She rose when he entered, hands open at her sides so he might see they were empty of demand. He said some courteous thing about the accommodations, and she thanked him as if accepting a plate. The rest was business, performed without meanness, without tenderness, and when he withdrew, shrugging into his robe with a soldier's efficiency, he paused at the door. "This marriage means nothing," he said, almost gently, like a teacher telling a child that the sum is not difficult if one does not insist on romance between the numbers. "You will have the dignity of your position, the freedom appropriate to it, and my absence more often than not. I ask only for discretion. It is best for us both." He inclined his head. A bow would have been too intimate. When the door closed, the candles fluttered as if someone had breathed upon them. Annabel sat. Her nightgown, a fine lawn her mother had called angel skin, felt like paper. She wanted, absurdly, to apologize to the room for failing to fill it with joy. She folded her hands until the bones in them stopped trembling. In the morning, London noticed her. It did not notice her with love. A duchess is not a woman at first. She is a report. The newspapers printed her name between lists of steeplechase winners and shipments arrived from India. The ladies who called the next week came out of curiosity the way one attends a new play. They sat on her chairs and took her measure in teaspoons. The exactness of her tea service, the steadiness of her smile, the way her eyes did or did not ignite at the mention of her husband. "The Duke is unavoidable," Lady Pembroke said, with fond malice, stirring sugar into her cup that did not need it. "One meets him everywhere, one hopes not to. Politics, banks, the ear of ministers. He has made himself a sort of weather." "And what weather is that?" Annabel asked, because questions are a form of armour. "High pressure," Lady Pembroke said, amused. "No rain, no thunder. A little hard to breathe." The laughter that followed was a soft animal, well-fed, comfortably cruel. Annabel smiled as one smiles at a well-told joke, and thought of a boy she had kissed once in a conservatory, a kiss that had known nothing of bank seals and allowance ledgers. The boy had smelled of oranges. The Duke smelled of clean wool and something like iron. Days arranged themselves along new rails. On Tuesdays, accounts. On Fridays, calls. On Sundays, church, where the curate spoke about charity, while the pews rustled like a drowsy forest. The Duke's presence threaded through these days like a thin wire. She touched it occasionally and felt the faintest current, an annunciation that he existed in the city like a law. He breakfasted early. He dined late, elsewhere. When they met, formality steadied their speech, as if they were both crossing a rope bridge over a drop they did not care to look into. She had not expected love. She had prayed for luck. Luck did not come, but something else did, something that could be used. In the Blue Suite, Annabel established a civilization of one. She plucked at the threads of Hartwick House until they made a map. The library's second shelf on the western wall hid the novels the Duke's father had disapproved. The Duke, apparently, had merely forgotten. The head gardener in winter liked his tea scalded and his sugar unannounced. A scullery maid hummed the same line of a hymn over and over when she was worried about her mother's cough. In her ledger, Annabel shifted money toward the infirmary the Hartwick Charities maintained in St. Giles. She signed the order with a hand that grew steadier week by week. At first, Mrs. Fairchild objected to each adjustment with the delicate firmness of a musician correcting a child's touch on a pianoforte. The roses are not cut on Mondays. The soup is not sent below. The Duchess does not visit the kitchen. Annabel learned the tempos, and when she could not bend them, composed new music where the old could not reach. She praised Mrs. Fairchild without invention. Competence longs for acknowledgment as much as beauty does. By Advent, the housekeeper's objections were fewer and phrased in questions rather than refusals. On a raw afternoon, the wind scraped like a blade along the edges of the square. Annabel took her lady's companion and went to the orphan school the Bedfords funded. Children, with their extravagant honesty, looked at her and did not see parchment or crest. They saw a woman with warm gloves and a basket of currant buns. She read them a story. She did voices for the animals, and did not do a voice for the father because she did not know what voice to give him. When the smallest girl, hair like hay, face like a winter apple, fell asleep against Annabel's shoulder, it felt like being handed a candle in a very dark church. "Your Grace," the schoolmistress whispered afterward, eyes bright, "if you were to speak to the Duke about the roof—" "I should like to see it," Annabel said, and climbed a ladder in a dress too fine for ladders. She touched the rot with her bare fingers. It crumbled like regret. The next week, a crew arrived with timber and tar. The roof breathed easier under new weight. "From His Grace," the steward said, delivering the invoice to her tray. The Duke's signature was precise and impersonal and oddly merciful. She traced the flourish with her eyes, not her finger. At night she slept. The first nights were stitched with shallow dreams, ribbons that would not tie, doors that would not open. But sleep is a stubborn animal, and eventually comes when called often enough. When the Duke came to her chamber, he was always polite, always careful, always distant. He thanked her. The first time he did, she almost laughed. The impulse was not unkind. It was simply astonishment that gratitude could sound so ceremonial when given for something so intimate. Later, when the door had closed and the fire had settled into embers, she said into the quiet, "Thank you," in the tone one uses for a man who steps aside in a narrow lane so that both may pass without bruising. The rumours began the way rain begins in a fine city. A softness you think is dust, a brightness in the air that is only the light rearranging itself, and then, suddenly, wet. Lady Victoria Blackwood returned from her country visit, or perhaps she had not left at all. The Duke went to his club. The Duke did not go to his club. The Duke was seen at a window that was not his own. The Duke was spoken to very intimately by a woman whose laugh collided with chandeliers. Annabel learned quickly that rumour is not interested in the truth so much as in the story that feels inevitable. The story that felt inevitable was not precisely that the Duke had a lover. It was that the Duchess did not have a husband. When the invitations arrived for Lady Harrington's ball, Annabel kept one. She laid it on her writing desk and watched it every morning as if it were a bird that might fly away. She would go. She would wear the emerald silk that made her skin look less like milk and more like something with heat to it. She would be looked at and would not be devoured by looking. She instructed Elia, sweet Elia, who had grown up in the nursery with her and learned at the same hour as Annabel how to keep tears inside until they were useful, about the pins and the gloves and the shoes that did not pinch. On the night of the ball, she descended the staircase of Hartwick House and saw him at the bottom of it. Surprise fluttered in her like a sparrow that had accidentally flown into a room and found a window impossibly closed. The Duke was home early. He turned toward her, and for an instant, no more, but enough, she saw something ungoverned alight in his eyes. It was recognition, perhaps, or simply the honest shock of beauty. She told herself not to value it. She noted it anyway. A life is built out of such notations. "You look very well," he said, voice softened by the smallest smile. "That color suits you." "Thank you," she answered, and discovered that receiving a compliment from a man who rarely gives them is like being given a flower picked in winter. You cannot help but think of the hand that searched through snow. They rode together. The carriage smelled faintly of lemon oil and London's ancient damp. He did not speak much. He never had. But when she glanced down, she noticed his glove hand had not quite closed. The fingers were relaxed, as if open to what the night might place in them. She resisted the absurd wish to place her hand there and watch what his fingers would do. The Harrington ballroom did what ballrooms are built to do. It transformed human frailty into glitter. The chandeliers found every secret pale and made it luminous. The music was agreeable. The gossip was oxygen. They walked in, and it was as if a hush came, not because the crowd admired, but because it calculated. Annabel felt calculation like a draught beneath a door. She lifted her chin the way a swimmer lifts her face toward light. "Courage," he murmured, close enough that she felt the word more than heard it. "I was not aware I lacked it," she said, and surprised herself with the truth in it. They made their bows and their turns, and the Duke performed society as a man uses a tool he did not design but has mastered, efficiently, without complaint. Introductions spun around them, names grazed her ears like low boughs, and then, inevitably as rumour, as rain, Lady Victoria Blackwood, striking as a yes one intends to regret. Her smile was an opinion. Her hand, when the Duke bowed over it, lingered like a visitor who mistakes hospitality for invitation. "So, this is the child bride," Victoria said, friendly as cold tea. "How charming. My dear Duke, you have been a stranger." "I am frequently accused of that," he replied evenly. Annabel thought of a roof, of small fingers sticky with currants clutching her sleeve, of a ledger in which numbers arranged themselves like obedient soldiers because she had asked them to. Child, then, but not helpless. Bride, then, but not ornamental. "It is a pleasure to be finally introduced," she said to the Countess, with such warmth that the compliment and its absence could be admired at once. Victoria's eyes, dark, bright, greedy, slid over Annabel as one looks at a painting to be appraised rather than a person to be known. "Undoubtedly," she murmured, and drifted on a current of admirers. "Family connection," the Duke said under his breath. "Of course," Annabel said, and the words lay between them like a piece of glass, ordinary until it is looked at from the wrong angle. They danced. His hand at her back was decorous. The waltz obliged them to proximity. Annabel kept her eyes lifted, not out of romantic rapture, but because the ceiling was a riot of painted angels, and she had decided, out of sheer cussedness, to enjoy something tonight. At the second turn, his gaze met hers. It was a glance like a question with no mark at the end. She answered with a small, inexplicable smile that felt like facing into a wind rather than turning away from it. "Is something amusing?" he asked, grave but not offended. "The angels," she said. "They are badly behaved." He looked up, and she saw the idea occur to him that laughter was possible at a ball. The lines at the corners of his mouth considered rearrangement. They did not, but the consideration itself was a novelty. "Annabel!" someone hissed at her elbow when the set ended. Catherine Pembroke, cheeks already flushed with triumph at having cornered scandal. "Tell me honestly, are you happy? It is only us. It is never only us." Annabel smiled the way one smiles at a child holding a candle too near the drapes. "I have discovered," she said lightly, "that happiness has more rooms than I imagined. I am exploring them." Catherine blinked, disappointed. She had been hoping for a map with a trap door. "How philosophical you have grown," she said, and drifted away to find someone less furnished. When the night's heat had turned the air into silk, and the gowns into testaments, and the rumour into scripture, Annabel stepped for a moment into the shadow of a potted orange tree by the French doors. The garden beyond was black and silver, a language she did not yet speak, but intended to learn. Behind her, voices rose and fell. His voice was not among them. He had been summoned into a cluster of gentlemen whose conversation bent the city like wire. She gave herself the luxury of 3 slow breaths. One for the girl she had been, one for the woman she was choosing, one for the man she had married, who might be both better and worse than anyone said. When she returned to the room, he found her. It gave her a small, startled joy that he looked relieved, as if the crowd had been an ocean, and he a swimmer once again in sight of shore. "Are you well?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I was finding a language for the garden." He glanced toward the doors. "Did it teach you anything?" "That it prefers moonlight to opinions," she said. A pause. Something like respect moved through his face, quick and discreet. "Shall we go?" he asked, when the midnight supper had been eaten and the violins had grown tender with fatigue. "Please," Annabel said. Her feet hurt, but not from defeat. In the carriage, London slid by in pieces, a lamplighter lifting his pole like a blessing, a woman drawing a shawl closer, a pack of boys asleep in a doorway as neatly arranged as puppies. They watched it together in a silence that felt less like absence and more like a cloth thrown over something still too bright to look at. At Hartwick House, the door clicked open as if the house had been standing behind it, listening for their step. In the hall's vast hush, Annabel turned to the Duke and said the bravest thing she had said all day, which was not very brave, but cost her enough to count. "Thank you for attending with me," she said. "It was necessary," he replied, too quickly to be kind. Then, slower, as if revising a document he had written long ago, "It was right." He lifted her hand then, as one lifts a relic carefully, aware of both weight and story, and bowed over it, not as a duke, but as a man making an attempt. His lips did not touch her glove. They did not need to. She felt the intention like heat. "Good night, Your Grace," she said, because formality was a country where both of them knew the customs. "Good night, Annabel," he answered, and her name in his mouth was a new coin, newly minted, still warm from the dye, worth something not yet determined, but promising to buy more than bread. She climbed the stairs. In her chamber, Elea unfastened the emerald silk with her usual deft kindness, and Annabel stood very still and let herself be unmade into linen. When she was alone, she sat at the vanity and looked at the woman in the mirror, who was both duchess and girl, and a third thing not yet named. She took the pins from her hair and laid them in their dish like little steel comets that had exhausted their drama. Somewhere in the house, the Duke's step crossed a patch of floor that remembered his father's tread and his grandfather's, and could not tell them apart. She wondered what it would take for a house to learn a new gait. "This marriage means nothing," he had said, and perhaps he believed it. Perhaps he needed to. But Annabel had discovered in a single evening that nothing is a very elastic word. It can stretch to hold small mercies, a compliment that had not been necessary, a hand that paused before closing, a name spoken like daylight. She blew out the candles one by one until the room was made of shadows and quiet. It was not peace. Peace would come or not, as it does. But she lay down with her hands open on the coverlet, as if to say to the darkness, "I am not empty-handed. I am learning the weight of invisible things." At some hour between midnight and morning, rain began. It tapped at the windows with insistence, and then settled into certainty. Annabel dreamed of a roof that did not leak, of children who woke with sticky lips and clean foreheads, of a garden lit by a moon, unmoved by opinion. When she woke, the rain still dared the glass. The city smelled briefly honest. The day had not yet decided to be cruel. She rang for tea. When it came, she drank it very hot. Across the courtyard, a door opened on the far corridor, his corridor, and shut again. She could not see him. She heard the impact of his boots, rhythmic, exact. A man who weighed each step, a man who counted. Annabel set down her cup and crossed to the window. The rain was doing its work. Even stone glowed a little under it. She placed her palm against the cold pane, matched her breath to the quiet beat of the weather, and thought, with that odd clarity that sometimes comes at the edge of surrender, "If meaning is forbidden, then I will become the author of the margins." She stood there until the glass no longer felt like a barrier, but like a page. Then she turned, lifted her pen, and began the day. The days that followed their wedding settled into a rhythm at once rigid and strangely fragile, like porcelain set upon a shelf too high to reach. Annabel rose each morning to the quiet authority of Hartwick House, footmen carrying trays, the housekeeper's clipped instructions, the rustle of silk skirts echoing through marble halls. She moved among them with grace, her back straight and her voice soft, never betraying how foreign the air felt in her lungs. To London, she was a duchess. To herself, she was still a girl counting raindrops on her window at home, wishing the sky would tell her a secret. Andrew, her husband, her stranger, was rarely present. His study door closed at dawn, opening only for dispatches, secretaries, or the occasional dinner where he spoke in sentences clipped as hedgerows. When he did address her, it was with politeness so meticulous it pressed more firmly than cruelty. And yet, sometimes, when he thought himself unobserved, she caught his gaze upon her as though she were a puzzle carved in glass, unsolvable, luminous, untouchable. She carried those glances like smuggled jewels, tucked away where no one could steal them. Loneliness became her tutor. It taught her to listen, to the creak of wood at night, to the murmur of servants when they thought her absent, to her own heart when it whispered questions she dared not answer. It taught her to observe, the way his gloves bore faint ink stains, betraying long hours at correspondence, the way he pressed his fingers against his temple after meetings, as if words weighed more than ledgers, the way he stiffened at laughter, as though mirth were an intrusion rather than a balm. These fragments painted a portrait of a man not cruel but closed, a fortress whose gates had rusted shut long before she approached them. Society, ever hungry, feasted on her solitude. At teas, whispers clung to her sleeves like burrs. The Duke has not brought her to the theatre. He dines at his club 4 nights a week. Poor girl, abandoned before the flowers of her bouquet have faded. Annabel smiled through it all, her composure polished into something that glittered like steel. But at night, in her chamber of pale blue silk, she pressed her palms to her eyes until the darkness behind them swelled like a tide. She told herself she would not cry, and yet she did, quietly, as if even her tears must obey decorum. Then, unexpectedly, a shift, small, but enough to set the air trembling. One evening, he returned from Derbyshire later than usual, his coat dusted with travel. She had left a candle burning, half hoping he might notice. He entered her chamber, not with the formality of a duke, but with the hesitance of a man who feared his presence unwelcome. "Forgive the intrusion," he murmured. She ought to have dismissed him, as etiquette allowed. Instead, she set aside her book and asked, "Was your business successful?" For the first time, his eyes softened. "Adequately so," he answered, almost sheepish. It was not tenderness, not yet. But it was not absence either. That night, when he departed for his study rather than his club, she lay awake, wondering if the ground beneath her feet had tilted, imperceptibly, but irrevocably. In the days that followed, more such moments appeared, slender threads glinting in the fabric of silence. A parcel arrived from Hatchard's, the Bronte novels she had once confessed to reading. No note accompanied them, but none was needed. Another evening, he lingered in the drawing-room long enough to ask awkwardly, "What do you read?" and seemed startled by the fervour in her reply. "You admire such strength," he remarked, almost wistful, when she praised the heroines. And when she insisted she possessed no such courage, he looked at her with quiet conviction. "You underestimate yourself." The words struck deeper than he could have known, rooting themselves in a heart long parched of kindness. Still, shadows remained. Lady Blackwood, beautiful and dangerous, hovered at the edges of their lives, her presence whispered in every ballroom, her name stitched to Andrew's with threads of scandal. Annabel endured the gossip with dignity, but each syllable gnawed at her. Could it be true? Was her marriage not only loveless, but also false? Doubt was a crueler companion than loneliness, for it spoke with her own voice. Yet when Andrew returned injured from the mines, his face pale, his leg bound, and she sat by his bedside refusing to leave, something shifted again. He looked at her with gratitude, raw enough to sting. "You are kinder than I deserve," he said. And when Lady Blackwood attempted to force her way into his chamber, he refused her firmly, choosing Annabel's presence instead. In that refusal lay a declaration more powerful than any vow. "I prefer you." Nights grew softer. Their conversations deepened, branching from weather and books to childhood, grief and dreams. She learned of his mother, gentle and lost too soon, whose roses still bloomed at Thornhill Park. He learned of her quiet rebellions, the way she had smuggled poetry under her Latin texts, the way she had once climbed a tree just to prove her brothers wrong. They discovered laughter, hesitant at first, then genuine, spilling like water over stone. And though his hand at her back remained cautious, it lingered longer. Though her words remained careful, they carried warmth she had ceased to fear. Still, doubt clung, until the night of Lady Harrington's ball. The room had been thick with rumour, heavy with Lady Blackwood's watchful eyes. And then, at the Marquis of Montrose's reception, when the Countess attempted her final assault, when she grasped Annabel's arm and spat venom for all of London to hear, the Duke stepped forward. He did not whisper. He did not equivocate. Before the entire assembly, his voice rang clear. "My heart belongs entirely and exclusively to my wife." In that instant, the fortress crumbled. In that instant, the marriage that had meant nothing began to mean everything. Annabel could hardly breathe. She had not begged for love, nor dared hope for it. Yet here it was, unfurling not in a secret chamber, but in the blaze of 100 candles, in the ears of all who had doubted her. He defended her not with duty, not with convenience, but with a truth so sharp it silenced the cruelest tongue. The world might still whisper. It always would. But she knew now where he stood, and it was beside her. When they returned home that night, she trembled not with fear, but with wonder. The man who had once promised her nothing had given her everything: trust, loyalty, and the first fragile blossoms of love. She sat by the fire long after he had gone to his study, the echo of his words pulsing through her like a heartbeat. "My heart belongs to my wife." She touched her own chest, as if to steady the truth. For the first time since her wedding day, she felt not like a prisoner in marble halls, but like a woman stepping into a garden, finding the air warmer than she had ever dared dream. And so their story turned. Not with a kiss stolen in shadow, nor with sudden passion like thunder, but with the steady light of dawn, slow, inevitable, and infinitely more enduring. The Duchess of Hartwick, once abandoned and pitied, was no longer alone. She was chosen. She was seen. She was loved. The morning after Lady Harrington's ball dawned with the hush that follows a storm. Night's scattered feathers, whispers, sidelong glances, the last brittle notes of the violins, had blown away, and Hartwick House breathed as if it had been holding itself rigid for months, and had at last remembered how to be a home. Frost silvered the inner courtyard. The fountain in its centre wore a lace collar of ice. Annabel woke to a world edged in light so delicate it seemed spun rather than born. She rose before the fire had found its courage, and wrapped herself in a shawl the colour of milk before it meets tea. The mirror held her calmly. The girl who had learned to inhabit silence had a different posture now, as if her spine had discovered its own song. Downstairs, a small table had been laid near the library windows with a restraint that felt like care. The good china without boasting, toast wrapped warm in a napkin, eggs that steamed as if they had opinions, a pot of coffee for him and a pot of tea for her. His doing, she suspected, Mrs. Fairchild would have set both for coffee in a room more grand. This was not grand. This was considerate. He arrived without fanfare, and yet the room shifted to accommodate him. Andrew wore no armour of evening, no white tie, no elaborate restraint. only a soft black coat and the slightly rumpled look of a man who had read into the dawn and then slept in a chair. His hair had forgotten its discipline. The sight of him unarranged felt more intimate than any gesture he might consciously perform. "Good morning," he said, and his voice startled her by being gentle and real instead of formal and correct. It was the voice he had used in the carriage last night, when he had said courage and she had believed him. "Good morning," she answered, and discovered that small words can become large if you let them carry your gratitude. They sat. The scrape of chair legs on wood, the pour of coffee, the sigh of the kettle, these domestic sounds plaited themselves into something that resembled peace. He buttered her toast with a seriousness that nearly undid her. It is a disarming thing to watch a powerful man attempt an ordinary kindness, and to see that he wants to get it right. "I presumed upon your patience," he said after a moment, almost formal again, but not quite. "Last night, You spoke truth," she said, not to save him from apology, but because she wished the words to be firm in the air between them. "Truth does not require permission." A breath left him, not quite a laugh, and not quite relief. The grey of his eyes warmed. "Then allow me to continue in the habit," he murmured, and took a sip of coffee as if truth, like caffeine, might yet steady the hand. They did not speak of Lady Blackwood. They did not have to. Some subjects are a winter field that both have crossed. There is no need to name every frost-burned tuft of grass. They talked instead of the day, a fragile thing of pale sun, and the work that waited. He had correspondence. She had accounts and a meeting with the head gardener about pruning the roses in a way that preserved wildness rather than punishing it. When she mentioned Thornhill Park, his mother's roses, he looked at her sharply, then softly. "My mother's garden," he said, tasting the words as if they had been locked in an attic too long. "You remember?" "You told me once," Annabel replied, not letting her voice dilute what she felt. "It mattered to you. I keep what matters." He did not look away. Whatever had been locked in him considered the latch. "Walk with me after luncheon," he said at last. "The greenhouse. There is a corner I have not entered since—" He stopped, as if the past had placed a hand on his sleeve. "It may be time." It was a small promise and a great one. She nodded. She finished her tea with slow care, as if swallowing an agreement. The morning set itself to honest labour. He disappeared into his study. She found Mrs. Fairchild in the hall, like a needle at the seam of everything. The housekeeper listened as Annabel described the infirmary's need for coal and the orphan school's need for stockings. At another time, Mrs. Fairchild might have reminded a duchess that her role was to sign, not to sew. Today, she merely said, "I shall see to it," and gave Annabel a look that, if not fond, had discarded suspicion. Respect is a slow climate, but once altered, it warms every room. At the orphan school, the smallest girl, Maggie, showed Annabel a loose button and a terror that buttons, once loosed, might all abandon ship. Annabel knelt, thread in her mouth, steady-fingered, and sewed the tiny bone back into place. Maggie exhaled in a gust and wrapped her arms around Annabel's neck with the ferocity of a sailor greeting land. When Annabel returned to Hartwick, her gloves smelled faintly of soap and ever so faintly of the schoolroom's chalk, and she was not ashamed of either scent. He was waiting in the hallway as if he had been listening for her footfall. He did not say that he had. He offered his arm, and she took it, and they became a geography lesson in how two separate countries might share a border. The greenhouse lay behind a clipped yew arch that the gardeners kept as stern as a vicar. Inside, however, sternness fled. Warmth rose like a living thing. Dampness wrote on the glass. Leaves breathed. A few late roses still dared the cold, their petals bruised to a beauty that was almost human in its imperfection. At the far end, a small door with peeling paint sulked closed. "My mother's room," he said quietly. "She nursed cuttings here through winters that would have broken other things." He did not ask her to open it. He rested his gloved hand on the knob and stood as if at a grave he had not visited. Annabel said nothing, she who had learned that some silences are not a void, but a vessel. At length he turned the knob. The door gave as if it had been waiting. The room was small and surprised by dust. A faint, ghostly scent of rosewater lingered, the kind that hides in wood the way old music hides in an instrument. On a shelf sat a narrow book bound in faded green cloth, its spine cracked like a smile made of memory. "She kept notes," he said, almost boyishly, crossing to it. He opened the book and his voice changed. "Look." He moved his body so she could read with him, a courtesy so instinctive it felt like family. Tiny letters marched down the page, tender and exacting. November 12th. Light poor. Andrew brought dead bumblebee, declared heroically that we might revive it with sugar, and we did. Roses too can be lured back to life with sweetness and sun and patience. Must remember. He stood very still. His breath made the page stir as if it were breathing too. "I had forgotten this," he murmured, "or taught myself to." Annabel read again, not the words this time, but the boy they framed. The boy with dirty knees and a dead bee that hadn't been dead at all. "Patience," she said softly. "Sun and sweetness." She did not reach for his hand. She let the words be the touch. He closed the book with reverence and held it as a priest holds a relic that is also personal. "I have been economical with sweetness," he said, the faintest rue clouding the grey. "I was spending it only on what could be counted." "And what cannot be counted?" she asked, curious rather than accusing. He lifted his gaze. In it she saw the long corridors of his life, rooms of duty, doors locked and forgotten, the echo of steps that had learned to sound like the men before him. "I am learning," he said simply, "if you will let me." "Let," she repeated, and something in her heart unclasped. "I would far rather encourage." A smile flickered then, quick and genuine and young, and the greenhouse took it into its warmth, as if smiles are cuttings too, and must be coaxed into blooming. Rain surprised the glass in a soft percussion, and for a moment they stood with their shoulders nearly touching, wrapped in the greenhouse's small summer while the world washed itself clean above. The days began to shape themselves around such places, rooms within rooms where something tender could grow unnoticed by those who would trample it. They played chess one evening in the library, not ambitiously. He taught her a gambit named with a flourish. She taught him to take delight in sacrificing a rook if the swindle pleased the storyteller in her. When he was called to a meeting with a minister given to outrage as a rhetorical device, he returned irritable and frowning, then apologized to her and meant it. She accepted and meant it more. He asked her to walk with him in a square where the lime trees held on to their last leaves like a chorus that knows the song is ending and does not wish to fall silent. She, braver now, told him she disliked the physician who spoke as if women were frail furniture. "Hire another," he said without hesitation, astonished that he had not thought of it sooner. Not all was gentle. The world had not reformed because a duke had spoken love aloud. Lady Blackwood remained, an elegant storm cloud. Invitations arrived, weighted with the expectation of spectacle, the court's desire to see if the new duchess would flinch, if the new husband would falter. They attended some, declined more, and when they went, they did so not as martyr and jailer, but as accomplices. The difference was everything. One evening, a letter arrived bearing the quick, expensive slant of Victoria's hand. Annabel found it on her writing desk beside the charity ledgers and a spray of late jasmine the head gardener had cut because he knew what a miracle it was to smell summer in November. She read. The words were silk over wire. Concern for Andrew's happiness. An offer of advice more worldly than the dear girl's relations can give. A suggestion that Annabel not strain herself with the heavy lift of expectations. Beneath the perfume, Annabel heard the sneer. "You are not built for this. Best leave the business of hearts to those who know their machinery." She wrote back with courtesy, so austere it was almost a weapon. "The management of my household and of my husband's contentment is my occupation and delight. Should your ladyship wish to advance your charitable endeavours, I would be honoured to include you in the Hartwick Winter Fund. Otherwise, I must beg to decline counsel on domestic matters. With all proper regard, A. Hartwick." She sealed the note with clear wax, transparent as truth. When Andrew came to her that night, he found the jasmine and the letter both, and his expression told her he understood each. "You handled it," he said quietly. "I did," she answered. "I am proud of you," he said. And the words, which could have sounded paternal or perfunctory, instead fell with the weight of acknowledgment, one sovereign to another, authority recognizing authority. Sometimes in the small hours, he woke from dreams he did not share, and sat, breath measured, as if somewhere within him a metronome refused to break. Those nights she did not ask for confession. She handed him the green-bound book, and he opened at random, reading aloud his mother's notes about grafting or mildew or the temper of a difficult white rose. Listening, the metronome inside him softened its insistence, and he would return the book to the table with a grateful hand, as if the past had set a glass of water within his reach. In December, he fell ill. It was not dramatic, no galloping fever, no hemorrhage to alarm the gossips, but a cold that went stubbornly to his lungs, and then sat there as if it had paid rent. The doctor came with his Latin and his leeches, refused, and his fussing, and prescribed broths and mustard plasters and patience. Annabel made the broths herself. She sat by the bed, reading to him where he half dozed, her voice threading through his exhaustion like a ribbon. When he woke sweating, she wiped his forehead and did not flinch at the intimacy. When he coughed until his eyes watered, she held the cup while he drank like a man rescued from drowning. In the grey middle of one night, when the candle guttered low and his breath sounded like paper being crumpled, he caught her wrist. "Why?" he croaked, not with the shallow vanity of a man who expects adoration, but with the terrible sincerity of one who has not known it and fears to mistake a mirage for water. She did not answer with words. She took his hand and laid it on her own chest, just below the collarbone, where the heart's knock is most earnest. "Because here," she said simply, "it hurts when you hurt." He closed his eyes. The hand on her breast was no longer a question, but a consent. "Then," he whispered when breath returned, "I am bound to mend." He did. Day by day, the cough loosened, the colour returned. The first afternoon he sat in the chair by the window. The January sun played fair and came through for him. He looked at her with a concentration that made her blush, as if she were a very young girl, and he a poet. "What do I owe you?" he asked, only half jest. "Your continued existence," she said gravely, and then smiled. "And perhaps, if the budget allows, more coal for the infirmary." "Done," he said at once, proving that love, in a duke, can be both tender and decisively administrative. He reached for her hand. "Annabel." She went to him without the self-consciousness that had once guided her every step. He lifted her hand to his lips, and then, as if a door long jammed had finally given way, drew her closer until she stood between his knees. He rested his forehead lightly against her stomach, not as a penitent, not as a supplicant, but as a man who has found at last where to lay the crown and be simply human for a moment. She smoothed his hair, darker now with health, and he shivered as if this touch were a language he had only learned to pronounce. "We are not what we were," he said, voice low. "No," she said. "We are what we are making." He looked up then, and in his eyes she saw not only gratitude, but the astonished joy of a traveller who realizes the map he distrusted has led him to a river no chart could show. He rose, still unsteady, and kissed her, carefully, as one uncorks a vintage preserved through wars and storms. It was not the first time his mouth had met hers, but it was the first time his heart had. When they parted, both were slightly breathless, not from greed, but from the awe that accompanies closeness when it is earned. They did not say forever. Forever is a cathedral whose bell is too large to ring at every small service. They said for now, with their hands and their breath and the quiet between them that, like the greenhouse air, held the promise of bloom. Winter deepened, and with it their household altered in ways only those who live inside it would notice. The footmen no longer braced themselves at the sight of the Duke and Duchess together, as if anticipating a storm. Mrs. Fairchild's mouth softened in the afternoons, and she took to bringing Annabel a cup of chocolate on particularly grey days, claiming it was for the complexion, which is to say, for the soul. The head gardener, instructed to leave a wildness in the rose beds, came to consult Her Grace's eye for courage. In the neighbourhood, shopkeepers began to speak of Hartwick's charity without the weary irony people reserve for noble patronage. The coal arrived on time and in adequate measure. The infirmary's stove stayed hot even when the wind sulked east. And London, ever superstitious about happiness, tested theirs. At a levee, a backhand compliment arrived from a dowager. At the opera, a glance like a thrown knife arrived from a man who had hoped to corner Hartwick in debt. He parried each with that new economy of sweetness, which is to say, with a refusal to spend anger on those who sought it. Annabel watched him become more himself, not less, as if truth had been a mineral deficiency all his life, and he had finally begun to take the proper tonic. At last, the invitation arrived that all had expected and many had wagered upon. A supper at Blackwood House. Refusal would have been a victory conceded. She could see the headlines in the ladies' journals, written with lace and poison. Acceptance would be a duel in silk. Annabel did not consult dread. She consulted the Green Book. January 28th. A white rose, discouraged. Lives if you move it to different light. Roots are braver than we are willing to admit. Do not be alarmed at droop. Offer a new angle to the sun. She dressed that evening in a gown the color of storm-lit pearl. He, immaculate but unadorned, wore a small spray of his mother's tea roses in his lapel, cut from the greenhouse with a reverence that made the gardener blink and pretend not to. In the carriage he took her hand before either had thought to speak. He held it without performance, his thumb tracing absent circles on her knuckles as if that were where he had placed his seal. Blackwood House was a baroque provocation. The stair demanded ankles, the mirrors demanded vanity, the chandeliers demanded surrender. Lady Blackwood, meetly radiant, received them with a smile polished to a blade's edge. Annabel curtsied. Andrew bowed. The night began as these nights do. Tidal compliments, terrain of gossip disguised as ceremony, music like water over a stone. When the moment came, and of course it came, it was not in a corner or behind a palm. Victoria drew them into a circle of luminaries near the hearth, the better to be observed. "Your Grace," she said to Annabel with the chaste poison of perfect diction, "we were just speaking of resilience, the rose and the nettle, as it were. Andrew has always preferred nettles." "Nettles feed butterflies," Annabel replied pleasantly, as if she had not been awake the previous night composing answers that would wound no one and yet defend everything. "Roses simply insist we take care." "And who takes care of Andrew?" Victoria asked, sweetly brutal. A tremor went through the listening room the way a hunting dog trembles when it senses game. Annabel felt Andrew's attention reach for her like a hand. She did not look at him. She kept her gaze on Victoria and let her answer draw strength from every stitch she had sewn, every ledger she had balanced, every breath she had measured during fever. "He does," she said, "and when he forgets, I remind him." It should not have been devastating. It was. It reseated the center of the room. It made Victoria's eyes flash, not with woundedness, which would have been interesting, but with inconvenience. The circle shifted its weight. A gentleman cleared his throat with the sound of a bet lost. The conversation rolled on, and in its current, Annabel felt the old story drown. Not completely. Plots have 9 lives, but deeply enough to delay its resurrection. On the ride home, he did not speak. He held her hand again, not absently now, but as one steadies a lantern around which night presses. At Hartwick, the house took them in as if it had waited at the door like a dog. In the library, they stood before the fire that had been banked but not forgotten. "Annabel," he said, and her name in his mouth was a vow. "There is more of me than I have given. I cannot change the past. I can cultivate the next season." She stepped closer until her skirts brushed his knees. "I am already growing," she said, a little breathless, "in the place you cleared for me when you chose to speak." His smile then, slow, astonished, helpless, was the first crack in winter that is not a fracture but a thaw. He drew her in. They did not combine into one person. That is for fairy tales and fools. They leaned, as two trees lean across a stream, and the arch they made was stronger than either trunk alone. And so the days advanced, humble and hard and radiant by turns. He rose earlier now to write not only to ministers and bankers, but sometimes to the schoolmistress or the infirmary nurse. She checked columns, and then added a column called Joy where no numbers lived, and recorded there the odd little victories that never make print. Maggie buttoned her own coat. The roses slept and did not die. Mrs. Fairchild laughed in the pantry at a joke about lemons. The Duke remembered to eat. In the greenhouse, the white rose accepted new light. In the Green Book, a fresh hand wrote a new line beneath the old. February 3rd. Some plants climb by twining. They do not strangle. They seek. Provide a trellis, not a chain. The weeks after Blackwood's supper unfurled like a ribbon, sometimes smooth, sometimes snagged, always leading Annabel and Andrew deeper into a life neither had expected to share. The scandal that might have consumed them instead gave way to something rarer. A marriage that London whispered about, not with pity, but with curiosity, even envy. And yet, beyond the gossip, there was a quieter story being written in corridors, in gardens, in glances that lasted longer than words. Hartwick House softened. Servants carried themselves with less tension, as though the walls no longer listened for quarrels that never came. Mrs. Fairchild's step grew brisker but not sharp, and she allowed herself small indulgences, an extra coal on a grey day, a smile when the Duchess passed. Annabel felt it too. The house that had once been a mausoleum of duty began to breathe like a living thing, warmed by the simplest of changes. Two people choosing not to stand apart. Spring came early. The greenhouse roses, coaxed by Annabel's hand and Andrew's cautious reverence, bloomed in colours so fierce the gardeners swore it was a miracle. They spent afternoons among them, Annabel with dirt on her gloves, Andrew with the Green Book open, reading his mother's neat notes as if each word were a spell against silence. When he looked up from a passage, February 10th, even the frail stem strengthens if given a trellis. His eyes rested on her in a way that made her heart bloom alongside the roses. There were outings, too. They walked along the Serpentine one windy day, her bonnet ribbons snapping like banners, his coat collar turned up against the cold. Crowds parted for them, curious eyes trailing their figures, yet Annabel felt no fear of scrutiny. His arm was steady beneath her hand, not as an obligation, but as an anchor. When a boy tripped and spilled a basket of apples at their feet, Andrew knelt without hesitation, gathering fruit and pressing coins into the child's palm. The boy's wide grin followed them down the path, and Annabel thought, "This is the man behind the fortress. This is the one I have married." Still, shadows lingered. Power breeds enemies as surely as wealth breeds rumour. Ministers demanded more of Andrew's time, their schemes tangling around him like vines. The Blackwoods did not disappear, they merely retreated, waiting for weakness. And within Andrew himself lay an old fear that if he gave too much of his heart, it might be taken, as his mother's had been, leaving him hollow. Annabel saw it in the way he sometimes withdrew after laughter, as if joy were a debt he could not afford. She did not press him with questions. Instead, she answered with presence, reading aloud by the fire, touching his hand in passing, creating a rhythm so steady that he might begin to trust it. One night, the rhythm faltered. He returned from Westminster late, his face drawn, his gloves stained with ink from endless petitions. She met him in the library where the fire burned low. Without a word, he crossed to her and rested his forehead against her shoulder. The weight of him startled her, not heavy with strength, but heavy with weariness. She lifted her arms, hesitant, then certain, and held him as if he were not a duke, but simply a man who needed rest. In that embrace, something fragile broke. Not him, but the barrier he had built. His voice came rough against her ear. "I am so tired of being impenetrable." She tightened her hold, whispering, "Then be human, at least with me." And he did. That night, the fortress did not merely crack, it opened its gates. From then on, their closeness deepened. He sought her counsel, not perfunctorily, but earnestly. She, who had once signed ledgers in silence, now debated with him about schools, about mines, about the poor who bore the weight of noble decisions. He listened, argued, sometimes conceded. Respect became the soil in which their love grew, richer even than passion. And passion came too, not in stolen bursts, but in steady flame, each touch layered with meaning. A kiss in the corridor, fingers brushing when passing a cup. A night when he lingered at her bedside, not out of duty but desire, and they discovered that tenderness could be fiercer than any storm. Yet love is not proof against trial. The Blackwoods launched one final blow, a pamphlet, printed anonymously, but penned with venom, accusing Annabel of neglect, of meddling in affairs beyond her sex, of trapping the Duke in a loveless union. Copies spread through drawing rooms like wildfire. Annabel found one on her writing desk, left there by some careless hand. She read it, her throat tight, her skin cold. Old fears surged. Was she still the child bride mocked at teas? Was her place beside him only a fragile loan? Andrew read it too. She watched his jaw tighten, the pamphlet crumpling in his fist. He did not rage, he did not storm. Instead, he summoned his secretary, dictated a letter to the Times, and signed it with a flourish that was both shield and sword. The Duchess of Hartwick is not merely my wife, but my partner in every sense. Any insult to her is an insult to me. Let London know. Our union is not convenience, but choice. The paper published it the next morning. London gasped, then marvelled, then, at last, respected. That evening, in the quiet after victory, Annabel stood with him on the balcony overlooking the square. Lanterns flickered, voices drifted, the city alive beneath them. She turned to him, her eyes shining with gratitude and wonder. "Why do you defend me so fiercely?" she asked softly. His answer was simple, unadorned, and truer than any vow. "Because you are mine," he said, then paused, his gaze searching hers. "And because I am yours." She felt the words like a seal pressed to parchment, hot and irrevocable. She reached for his hand, and he clasped it, and together they looked out at the city that had once doubted them, now bearing witness to a love that had grown from nothing into everything. The night wrapped them in its velvet, and though the world might test them again, Annabel knew they would endure, for she had found not only a husband, but an equal, a companion, a heart that beat in time with hers. And so, beneath the stars, they stood side by side, not Duke and Duchess, not rumour and scandal, but Andrew and Annabel, two souls who had learned that love, when chosen and defended, is the strongest fortress of all. Summer arrived, as if someone had opened a window in the sky. Morning light spilled through Hartwick House and softened edges that winter had sharpened. The marble staircase seemed less severe, the portraits less exacting, the hush less like a rule and more like a courtesy. The roses, disciplined all spring by patient pruning and a gardener's superstition, exploded into colour. Annabel woke with the scent of them in her hair, and more intoxicating still, the certainty that she belonged to the day before it had even begun. They had fallen into a liturgy of ordinary happiness. Breakfast by the eastern windows, his coffee and her tea, the Times folded into an argument he pretended not to be losing. A walk when the street was still in its chemise of mist. Letters, visits, the quiet work of charity. After supper, the greenhouse, his mother's notes, her laughter, the companionable silence of two people busy with the same devotion. She could have lived in that small summer forever. On the afternoon the letter came, the air was mean with heat. Even flies seemed tired of their own persistence. Annabel had returned from the infirmary with flour on her cuff, and a feeling she recognized only now as peace. A child's fever broken, a cot mended, a nurse kissed on both cheeks for the miracle of good sense. In her sitting room a single envelope rested on the escritoire. It was thick and white and unmarked. No crest, no hand she knew, only the faintest smear of soot on its edge, as if it had passed too close to a chimney. She broke the seal. There were 4 lines, each a stone. Tell your husband the men underground breathe dust and promises. Tell him the ledger does not count lungs. Tell him the Hartwick mines choke on his name. Tell him a fire knows the way to a house that forgets. It was unsigned. The letter shook, not because her hands trembled, but because the words did, as if they were a creature alive with its own hunger. She read it again, then once more, and did not call for anyone. She took it to Andrew. He read without changing colour. He read as he read everything, completely. When he finished, he placed the letter on the desk and laid his palm on it as though it might attempt escape. The new ventilation shafts are nearly complete, he said, as if reciting proof against superstition. Wages have increased twice this year. The inspectors... She shook her head gently. This isn't a ledger problem, she said. It's a heart problem. And hearts write in a fire's tongue. He looked at her then with the old ache and the new trust. I will go north, he said, not in defiance, but in answer. Tomorrow. I'm coming, she said, and he didn't argue. They left before the city remembered its contempt for dawn. Steam and soot and the personal smell of a railway carriage, leather, dust, a previous traveller's impatience, made a world that was both cramped and infinite. He stared at miles as if they were sentences he must pass. She watched him, and sometimes the fields. The mines at Hartwick Vale had once been a rumour dug into hills. Men with picks and hopes dragging down the sky. Now they were a machinery of need, engines and pulleys and mouths that opened when coal demanded rescue. Andrew walked the galleries with the manager and the foreman and the union men, and he walked them with Annabel, who did not let the dark bully her, and did not let soot be mistaken for the truth. She listened to the men. She asked a question so simple it sounded like a child's. "When did you last breathe clean air?" They laughed. Then they stopped laughing because she did not. Ventilation improved, yes. Wages oiled, yes. But fear, unaddressed, grows teeth. At the end of the third day, a man with eyes like slate and a mouth like a scar stepped out from behind the engine house. He did not remove his cap. "Your Grace," he said, and made of the title an insult. "Your Lady." Andrew stood still. "Mr. Pike," he said. "Fine changes," Pike went on, glancing at the newly braced beams, the fresh-painted hazard boards. "Fine words, fine letters to the papers. But a boy died last winter for want of a ladder that came a week late. The boy's mother doesn't read the Times." His gaze slid to Annabel. "You were right about hearts, your ladyship. They burn." "Grief burns," she said quietly. "It's not the same as hate." "They'll do for each other on a cold night," Pike replied. "Tell the Duke there are men who think fire answers what the Times will not." "Tell those men," Andrew said, his voice steady, "that I will face them above ground or below it. But if they set so much as a spark to a house with servants sleeping inside, I will see them taken in irons by the men they pretend to defend." Pike's mouth twitched. "We are not fools," he said. "We do not burn our own." He touched his cap to Annabel with a courtesy that felt like sarcasm's older, sadder brother. "Your ladyship." He walked away, small against the engines that had learned to eat men for breakfast. They returned to London with coal in their lungs and a day's worth of sleep owed to them by the earth. The city met them with its usual self-regard, wheels and hooves, and the impatience of thousands. That evening, the house seemed grateful to have them back. The butler stood a little taller. Mrs. Fairchild permitted herself the extravagance of relief. Elia laid out a gown light as blown sugar because heat still sulked in the corners. After dinner, they went to the library, not for conversation, but for presence. He took up the green book. She took up her knitting, a project so irregular it had to be destined for someone who would forgive mistakes. Outside, the sky blackened without ceremony. Summer's nights are efficient like that. Annabel was just thinking how grateful she was for the simple act of their continued breathing when the air changed. It was small at first, a rumour of smoke where no smoke should be. A moment later, it was not rumour, but arrival. Somewhere in the west wing, a footman shouted, one word, ancient and always late, "Fire!" They were out of their chairs before the book could fall from his hand. Fire has a particular sound when it stops courting and begins to court-martial. It is the sound of fabric making up its mind. It is the sound of air remembering its other job. The house woke at once. Bells shrieked. Water ran like panic. Men's voices squared themselves into commands. In the corridor, smoke crawled along the ceiling in a black tide. Elia, eyes wide, met Annabel with a bravery that would later make a story for children. "The nursery wing is clear," she said, breathless. "Mrs. Fairchild is counting the maids." "The study," Andrew said, already moving toward the west. "The safe, papers we cannot afford to feed the flames." "Servants first," Annabel said, "because love must be more than the heart's appetite." "I'll take the east stairs. The scullery girls will be hiding." They split as if rehearsed. Later, each would insist the other had chosen the more dangerous errand. Annabel ran with her skirts gathered and did not think of dignity. She thought of faces. Maggie, when she is afraid. The laundress who whistles wrong notes. The boy with a twisted foot who polishes the brass as if it were the moon. She found two girls under a table, lungs heaving like trapped birds, and coaxed them out with lies. "It's only smoke from the kitchen range," she said, and then spoiled her own story by coughing. She pressed cloths to mouths. She counted heads. She drove bodies before her like a shepherd. When she emerged into the courtyard with a stream of servants at her back, the night had found its spectacle. The west wing bled flame from 3 windows. Sparks lifted and fell like doomed petitions. A ladder clattered. Someone screamed. Someone else said the name of God too calmly. Annabel looked for Andrew and didn't find him. "Where?" she asked, and her voice, usually so gentle it could persuade bread to rise, cut the courtyard like a blade. "In the study," Mrs. Fairchild gasped. "He went for the deeds, the mine contracts, the—" Alea's hand was on Annabel's arm. It trembled, and for a single wild second, Annabel wanted nothing more than to tremble with it. Instead, she took the trembling hand and pressed it once, hard, as if sealing an oath into skin. "Keep them here," she said to Mrs. Fairchild. "Do not let anyone go back in. Do you understand me?" Her own feet were already carrying her toward the west doors. "Your Grace," a footman began, but he knew better than to stand in front of her. Smoke took her like a jealous lover. Heat flattened her. She wrapped a wet kerchief around her mouth and tasted ash and old varnish. The corridor to the study was a throat of flame. She hugged the wall. She had never thought of the house as wood before. Tonight it was nothing else. The study door was shut. Heat had made its handle into a warning. She pulled her glove over the kerchief and leaned her weight into the wood. It resisted like a stubborn man. She pushed like a woman who had gone past negotiation. The door gave. Inside, the room was a cathedral of sparks. Books smouldered like failed prayers. The safe stood open. Andrew stood before it, coughing, his hair plastered to his temples, a bundle of papers under his arm. He stared at her as if she were a hallucination he welcomed. "Annabel, no speeches," she said, because if he spoke love, she would not be able to move. "Come." They moved. The world narrowed to the next breath. The floor complained beneath their feet, the old complaint of wood that was never made for this. And a beam fell in the corridor they had just cleared. Fire ate the arch of it with a drunken appetite. She felt Andrew's hand on her back, steady and inexorable, refusing her refusal to stumble. In the vestibule, the smoke thinned as if mercy had remembered its brief. They shoved through a door that had once been decorous and now was only an obstacle, and then the night had them. Air can be a feast. She ate it. He bent double and fed a lung back into service. Men's hands were suddenly everywhere, more urgent than manners. Water flung itself in buckets at the west wing, as if late apologies could drown guilt. The papers survived, a ridiculous bundle she wanted to laugh at and then burn herself for revenge. Andrew straightened. There was soot on his cheek. Her hand went to it before she remembered that touching implies ownership. She touched anyway. He caught her wrist. The courtyard spun and steadied around the axis of a look. "Do you know," he said hoarsely, "how near I came to believing I could do without you?" "Yes," she said. "I married you." The wing did not collapse. That is the whole of the miracle. The fire chewed, the men fed it the wrong meal, the house, old and proud and greedy for its own continuation, decided to live. By dawn, the flames had sulked themselves to sleep. The west rooms were black-boned, but the structure held. Mrs. Fairchild counted again, and no one was missing. The butler wept in a doorway where no one could see, and of course everyone did. The city woke to the smell of another's almost ruin, and shook its head as if fate had been a wedding guest turned away. They slept at noon, an hour stolen like bread. They slept in the same bed without discussing it, because some decisions are not made in language. When they woke, he was already watching her. Heat had blistered the skin along his wrist. She kissed it before she could remember that one does not kiss injuries as if one were a mother with a child. He did not remind her of the rule. He turned his hand and kissed her palm. It felt like an answer to a question she had asked the night she pressed her hand to a cold window, and promised herself she would author the margins. In the days that followed, the West Wing wore its wounds like a soldier who is tired of being brave for other people. Carpenters came, plasterers tutted, architects spoke of angles with consolatory grandeur. In the greenhouse, the roses, who have never read the news, insisted on blooming. Annabel sat there sometimes when the hammering made memory too loud. The green book lay on the bench beside her, open to a page she had found with a kind of dumb gratitude. June 17th. A cane broken by wind can be splinted and saved. Bind it gently. Do not tie it to something that will not bend. The strength is in the give. She showed it to Andrew that evening. He read, then set the book down, and took her face in both his hands, as if he had never quite understood that faces are where the soul comes nearest to the skin. "If I have tied you to anything that cannot bend," he said, "forgive me." "You are learning," she told him. "So am I." They went north again, not for fear this time, but for breath. Thornhill Park received them with its acres and its ghosts. His mother's roses, left to their own devices for too long, had tangled themselves into a problem that was also a promise. They spent mornings dirtying their elegant hands, afternoons walking until their conversation wore itself down to a contented silence, evenings with the windows open and the sky a sermon that asked nothing and gave much. It was there, in a room that smelled of soap and lime and a century of summer, that she first felt the odd secret pull, the sea-tide sensation of a body adding a room in which another might live. She kept that knowledge folded within her for 3 days, testing it against hopes and fears. She told herself it might be nothing. She told herself it might be everything. On the 4th morning, when the light made the drapes honest, and her stomach made its small, undeniable protest, she went to him in the parlour, where he was pretending to read and actually listening to the bees. He looked up, and whatever mask a man wears to defend himself against joy fell without a sound. "Annabel?" She sat beside him and placed his hand, capable, scarred, a little ridiculous in its owner's confidence, flat upon her abdomen. "If there is a gardener in heaven," she said, trying to keep her voice from breaking, "he has assigned us a new bed to tend." He did not speak. He set a hand over his own heart, as if accustomed to confirming rumors at the source. Then he laughed, a quiet, impossible thing, and then he did something she would remember when the world forgot its manners. He bent until his forehead touched her stomach, and he whispered a greeting to a soul not yet cramped by the world's scale. When he lifted his head, his eyes shone with something so unarmored it took her breath. "Sweetness," he said, as if the word were a sacrament. "Sun, patience, I remember." They walked the property until their news had soaked into the fields. Every hedge seemed to approve. Every bird seemed impossibly personal. In the greenhouse at dusk, he found a stick of soft pencil and the gentlest of his mother's old labels, and wrote without flourish, "New rose, not yet named." He tied it to an empty cane and pressed the stick into the soil. "We will name when we meet," he said. "All good things deserve their proper christening." Letters were written. The doctor came and nodded and hid his grin in his handkerchief. Fairchild, apprised via a perfectly unruffled note, allowed herself to cry for 19 seconds, dried her eyes with linen, and ordered hell loosed on the linen closet, such that not a single blanket in Hartwick would dare be less than exemplary. The orphan school sent a parcel bundled in brown paper, tiny socks, one inexplicably longer than the other, knitted with the optimism of children who believe stitches are a kind of insurance. Maggie's included a scrawled picture of a rose with a face. Annabel put it on the mantel as if it were a portrait by an old master. London, when told, pretended to already know. It congratulated itself on having suspected it all along. It sent gifts. It sent gossip. It threatened to send advice. Andrew made of his secretary a breakwater and of his love a harbour. He refused 3 dinners, 2 committees, and 1 duel by editorial with a man whose chief accomplishment was a loud coat. He accepted invitations from those whose presence refreshed rather than extracted. He learned to say no with a sweetness that shamed demand. There were difficult days. Bodies are not clocks that can be wound and set. Some afternoons the world narrowed to a cool washcloth and a chair placed exactly where it would catch breeze. Some nights she wept because joy too frightens. He did not try to reason her out of either. He read the Green Book aloud. He learned to brew broth and botch it and then learn again. He sat on the floor with his back against her chair when her back ached, as if his spine could take a portion of the complaint. He spoke to the not yet named with a gravity that made the future blush and draw near. On an evening in late August, they returned to London. The West Wing was nearly whole again. New beams owned the sky like promises reinforced with iron. The study smelled faintly of ash. No fire would ever completely release, and strongly of lemon oil, which is how houses forgive. In the greenhouse they found 3 buds on a cane that had in spring insisted upon dying. Annabel touched one with the back of her knuckle. "You stubborn thing," she murmured, and felt understood. They decided, quietly, privately, and without ceremony, to mark the rebuilding with a vow no congregation would hear. At twilight, with the house hushed and the city occupied with its own appetites, they stood in the greenhouse among the roses. He wore no coat. She wore a gown no one would see. The Green Book lay open to a blank page. "I will not promise never to be afraid," he said, fingers finding hers without searching. "Fear is honest. I will promise to tell you when it comes, and to let you stand nearer when it does." "I will not promise never to doubt," she answered, the words falling into the space between them like seeds. "Doubt visits when joy feels too large for our rooms. I will promise to open a window for it, and then to shut it. I will build," he said simply. "I will tend," she said. "And we will name," he added with that new smile that still managed to look surprised to be allowed out in public. They kissed, not as if sealing a treaty, but as if acknowledging that treaties are only necessary because people forget what kisses know. When they parted, twilight had declared itself night. Somewhere in the city, a bell decided it was time to be important. In their small summer, it was all the time there would ever be. She labored in winter. Snow swaggered outside, disguising grime as purity, making roofs into sermons. The house became a machine built for mercy. Women who had done this before came and spoke in the low registers of mountaineers. Andrew was a student any teacher would boast of. Silent when silence was lesson, brave when bravery was to stay, useful in the ways prescribed. He soaked cloths. He counted breaths like a banker who has learned to count the right currency. He bent his head once against the door and asked whatever had arranged the stars to widen its generosity for this one room. The child came with a cry that made everything unreasonable for a while. There was blood, and there was the world turning on a hinge that had not been properly greased since Eden. And then there was a voice, shockingly small, already opinionated. Annabel laughed and wept, and fell into the beautiful emptiness that follows fulfillment. The midwife said something secular and holy. Someone placed the baby, angry, perfect, the precise weight of a soul newly laced to flesh, upon Annabel's chest. Andrew did not seem to know how to move. He moved anyway, careful in a way that made the air careful with him. He touched a tiny hand, then snatched his own away as if unqualified, then gathered courage and let the miniature fingers close around the slope of his knuckle. The baby scowled at him, which is to say, looked. "Hello?" he said, and his voice found its gentlest instrument. "We have been waiting." They named her in the greenhouse the first day the baby knew sunlight. The white rose that had refused to die had opened 3 blooms the color of daylight that has decided to stay. They stood with the child between them, babbled at by happiness and the gardener both, and Andrew wrote on a narrow label with ceremonious care, "Annabel's Grace." "Too much?" he asked, wry, already guessing the answer. "Exactly enough," she said, because it was. Mrs. Fairchild, who had always insisted she did not cry, cried a little and called it steam. Elia, who had learned to be brave under tables, was brave in pews and sang off key to the baby with a confidence that made key irrelevant. Maggie sent a drawing wherein roses had eyes and the baby had teeth. Love is an untidy artist. London, alerted by the machine it had built to inform itself of other people's joy, declared the baby fashionable. Fashion is less durable than love. They took the congratulations and placed them on a shelf behind the nappies, where civic pride could not fall upon a sleeping child. The Blackwoods sent a gift that was beautiful and impossible to accept in good faith. Annabel wrote a thank you that was beautiful and impossible to read as surrender. At night, the house made the new noises of a life recently announced. The small imperative of hunger, the satisfied sighs of sleep, the fussy negotiations of a body learning its first laws. Andrew learned to walk with a different footfall near the cradle, as if the floorboards had, in one night, developed nerves. Annabel learned that exhaustion and joy are cousins who share the same bed. She learned that her body, a country she once thought of as a duchy some other sovereign ruled, was sovereign at last, its borders redrawn by love and use. Sometimes, when the baby slept and the city remembered to be quiet, they would slip to the greenhouse with the child wrapped in wool and faith. They would stand beneath glass that had known fire and repair, and they would watch the condensation write a language only dawn could read. He would hold the baby, she would hold the green book. The roses would do what roses do, which is to insist on beauty in a world frequently bored by it. "Do you know," he said once very softly, not to boast but to marvel, "I used to believe that meaning was something a man purchased with work alone. That joy, if it came, was a dividend." "And now?" she asked, resting her head against his shoulder in the old, new way. "Now I think meaning arrives when a man allows himself to be part of the thing he serves," he said. "And joy is not wages. It is weather." She smiled. "And we," she said, "finally learned to open the windows. If the world tested them again, and it did, in ways grand and petty, because the world cannot bear not to, they answered with the knowledge winter had given them. Bind gently, bend with purpose, choose sweetness without squandering it. The west wing, reborn, did not forget. It creaked differently at night, as if recounting to itself the story of being spared. The servants, many of whom had carried buckets and fear through smoke, stayed longer than servants usually do. The orphan school's roof did not leak. The mines breathed better. Mr. Pike came to a meeting and left with his hat in his hands and an expression a man makes when his anger finds itself oddly unneeded. And when spring returned, shameless and right on time, the cane labelled Annabel's Grace gave up a flush of blooms so pure they made conversation unnecessary. They cut the first and set it in water by the cradle. The baby sneezed at it and then smiled, an expression that rearranged the furniture of two souls in a single instant. Later that evening, long after congratulations had been dutifully endured and the last lamp had admitted defeat, they found themselves again in the greenhouse. The city hummed beyond like a neighbour always washing something. The baby slept. The green book lay open to a new page. Andrew's hand, slower but surer now, wrote neat lines beneath his mother's last entry. April 14th. A house that has burned fear's candles. Light them anyway. Teach the rooms a different flame. Annabel read the words, and then looked at the man who had written them. He looked back, and they did not need to say anything about fires or winters or letters that smell of chimneys. They stood as they had stood 100 times before, and as they would stand again. Two separate trees leaning toward each other across a stream, making of their leaning an arch under which the future could pass dry-shod. Outside somewhere, a bell began to ring for someone else's feast day, someone else's grief, someone else's ordinary hour. Inside, their small summer kept its climate. He reached without looking and found her hand as he always did now, not because he remembered, but because forgetting had become impossible. She squeezed as she always did now, not to reassure, but to answer. "Sweetness," he said, because some words deserve to be a refrain. "Patience," she answered, because some virtues are works in progress. "Sun," he added, smiling, because even in London there is more of it than people admit. They did not promise forever. They did not have to. The roses, stubborn as gossip and kinder, were doing it for them.